Last week we set up the controls so we could stop compensating for the stock or what somebody else's ideal lever and pedal position was. This week we're going to adjust our bike's suspension sag. Now I'm going to do this as much as possible without another person's assistance, and there are more detailed methods to complete this procedure you can probably find on YouTube, but for everyday street riding, here's a quick method to get your suspension sag dialed in. We're going to need a calculator, a metric tape measure, a zap strap or zip tie, tools to adjust our fork and rear shock preload, and some way to securely lift the bike off the ground, either by using the center stand or side stand, or a hoist or scissor lift. And when it comes time to measure the impact of our weight on the suspension, we'll also need to hold it still with the kickstand up. So a wheel chock or being close to a wall, or in my case, I'm using a closed garage door. First off, let's briefly explain what's going on when we adjust motorcycle sag. What the goal is here is to have the motorcycle with the rider on board at a level that takes advantage of all of the suspension travel without bottoming out. We make this adjustment through adding or removing spring preload. Take a look at this fork spring. See how the coils are tightly wound at the top of the spring and more loosely wound at the bottom. This spring also has a slight conical shape. This is what's called a progressive spring. And as this spring is initially loaded with force, the spring coils that are more loosely wound compress with less resistance during that initial load. As the shock or fork travels through its stroke, the more tightly wound coils now take the load and resist compression at a greater rate than the loosely wound ones. Progressive springs are used typically on the street, since they offer a compromise between a stiff and a soft spring. As with most compromises though, they're not perfect. Linear springs are used in racing, and these springs use the same spring rate throughout the shock or fork stroke and give the rider a better feel for what's happening on the track. In racing, springs are changed based on the track and the speed the rider is going. If you're riding across town and then up to the canyon for some twisties, a linear spring is either going to suck while you're riding through town or when you get to the twisties. Your choice. A progressive spring will most likely suck both in town and on the twisties, but to a lesser extent. For progressive springs to compensate for changing roads, rider weight, and traveling speeds, we can either add or remove some spring preload. By adding or removing preload, we're applying a tensioning load of force on the spring. If we add preload, we use up some of the low resistance of the loosely coiled spring in favor of getting the shock or fork into a range where more load is transmitted to the tightly wound and stiffer coils where there's more resistance. Adding or removing preload does not affect the total amount of suspension travel. It just determines what coils in that spring will be active during the shock or fork stroke. Adding preload stiffens the suspension, and we don't run as much risk of bottoming out. Removing preload softens the suspension. The same is true with the rear shock, as preload is managed through an adjustment wheel or tightening or loosening a threaded preload adjustment fitting directly above or below the shock spring, or on a cog that has a predetermined setting. Okay, let's get to it. Calculating your front fork sag is done by figuring out what the total suspension travel with no weight on the forks is, let's call this number L1, and subtracting the remaining suspension travel when the rider is in gear and on the bike. For our purposes, this number will be L2. The difference between these numbers should be 25 to 33% of that L1 number, or the total suspension travel available on the bike. L1 minus L2 equals our sag number, or S1. In order to calculate what percentage of sag you have, take that S1 number and divide by that L1, and then multiply that number by 100 to get the percentage. If your bike sag is more than 33% of your L1 number, increase your preload. If it's less than 25%, decrease your preload. To show you what I mean, we're going to work with my VFR 1200 and figure out what that L1 number is. You can do this by unloading your suspension. pulling your bike on its stand and having a friend measure the available travel in the fork slide. If you're working with a conventional non-inverted fork, then you can use the lower fork tree as your measuring point. Since the VFR 1200 doesn't have a center stand, and I'm trying to do this without an assistant, I used my hoist and scissor jack to determine the total available front suspension travel. Now this differs from axle travel indicated in the manual. The measurement I took indicated 127 millimeters, which is our L1 number. With this first measurement, I can now calculate our SAG goal, which is 32 to 42 millimeters. What you'll find is that in most motorcycle applications, the SAG numbers are between 30 and 40 millimeters. I now move the bike outside, and to help calculate the fork's actual SAG, I'm using a zap strap around the fork. I'm placing it up against the dust seal, which is at the top of the slide on the inverted forks of the VFR 1200 and at the bottom of the forks on the VFR 800. If our SAG is set correctly, we should have between 95 to 85 millimeters from the top of the zip tie to the bottom of the slide tube. Now in full gear, I can take the bike off the side stand and use the garage door to steady myself on the bike. Measuring from the bottom of the fork slide to the top of the zip tie will now indicate how much suspension travel I've used. If your forks are conventional and not inverted, just measure again from the bottom of the fork tree to the bottom of the zip tie. This bike needs more preload to reduce the amount of sag that we have already. Too much sag will give the front end a bit of a wallow feeling, and the forks will bottom out when they hit a bump when braking. When you brake, the bike's weight is transitioned to the front forks. Without enough preload on the front springs, if you hit a bump, the forks will bottom out the complete length of the available travel. This makes the bike unstable. Too much preload and not enough sag makes the front suspension stiff, transitioning bumps in the road to your hands and wrists. The goal of setting the sag is to use as little of the preload adjustment that you can in order to get the sag numbers that you need. If you've used all of the preload and you're still not at that 25 to 33% zone, then you need stiffer springs, which will make a good video this winter on this bike because we're very close to using all the preload. Now, what if your forks look like this? How can you adjust sag? Well, you can opt for stiffer springs. Springs are measured by the amount of weight it takes to move or compress them 1 millimeter. The stock spring on the VFR 1200 is an 8.5 or rather 0.85 rating. This means that it takes 0.85 kilograms or 1.87 pounds to compress the spring 1 millimeter. Moving to a 1 kilogram or 1.1 kilogram spring will dramatically increase the tension on the spring and reduce the amount of preload we need to achieve our sag numbers. When buying new springs, they may come with, or you can make up, some spring spacers that will allow you to manually preload the spring as well. Just make sure the metal tube or PVC spacer that you use is hard and thick enough to support your suspension. For the rear of our VFR 1200, I need a hand. You need to be able to measure the bike from a point on the swing arm or axle to an upper part of the frame. Then you can get on the bike and have that second set of hands measure those points with you in full gear, as before. This time we're looking for a sag value equal to the amount of sag that you put in the forks. So in our case, the front forks after adjustment are 38 millimeters of sag. The rear sag should also be 38 millimeters. If your bike has too much or too little sag, it'll ride unevenly. This will affect the bike's handling during acceleration and braking significantly. For street applications, just make sure that your bike is level. So whatever your sag was in the front, that's what it should be in the back. That's it. Our sag is adjusted. And after last week's videos, our controls are all dialed in. Time to get out and enjoy the ride with confidence, knowing you've just fine-tuned and customized your motorcycle. And whatever you're doing or wherever you're going, be sure to ride safe.